So this little video deals with IMR and CMR, individual ministerial responsibility and collective ministerial responsibility. What are their strengths and weaknesses? What case studies might there be? And how significant are they? So the reason for doing this video in particular is that Prime Minister and Executive in paper 2 clearly says 3.2, the concept of ministerial responsibility might come up in the examination. Now 3.3 is not there. That's the section that deals with presidential style government versus prime ministerial versus cabinet government. The case studies, the in-depth case studies you would have done of prime ministers, they are not there. So it really does suggest that the concept of ministerial responsibility, both IMR and CMR, might come up as a question in the summer. Probably is as a source question. I could very much envisage a source question, maybe with Priti Patel, a newspaper article based on the Priti Patel case coming up. So it'll be interesting to see whether it's a source question or an essay question, if indeed it does come up at all. So what are they? There is some similarity between the two, but CMR and IMR are different and something that many students do mix up in their examinations. So it's really important to make sure you're clear on which is which. IMR, individual ministerial responsibility, is a convention under which a government minister takes responsibility not only just for their own actions, but for all decisions made within their department, even if they're not fully aware of any decisions that are made. They are ultimately responsible for everything that happens within the jurisdiction of their department. CMR is collective ministerial responsibility, and this is the convention that the government acts collectively. Government decisions are taken collectively, whilst ministers might disagree in private. In public, decisions are supported by all ministers, and if someone can't support a government decision, they're expected to resign. Now, importantly, it's important to highlight the term convention here. So a convention is something which doesn't legally have to be followed, but normally is. So for example, in everyday life, a convention is that if you are sitting on a train and a pregnant lady gets on, you give up your seat. There's no law that says you have to do that, but it's very much accepted that that is the done thing. So these are things that aren't legally enforceable, but are very much expected to be taken forward. And a serious breach of either of these conventions should, in theory, lead to the resignation of any of the ministers responsible for that breach. Now, traditionally, they were purely conventions, okay? But since 1997, they've been codified into something called the Ministerial Code. Now, the birth of this was a little bit earlier. It was based on something called the Nolan Report, which highlighted the different principles that public servants should uphold in their jobs and indeed in their lives. These were selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. And by convention, since 1997, the Ministerial Code has been published. This is the kind of handbook for how ministers should behave. And it's published at the start of each premiership, so it's updated by every new Prime Minister. So it was last updated in 2019. On the subject of IMR and CMR, this is what the Ministerial Code says. The principle of collective responsibility applies to all government ministers. Ministers have a duty to account and to be held to account by Parliament for all decisions and policies within their department. Ministers must not knowingly mislead Parliament, and if they accidentally mislead Parliament, they should correct the record. And the ministers should ensure there is no conflict between their public duties and their private interests. So these are the different things that make up the Ministerial Code. But importantly, the Ministerial Code is enforced only by the Prime Minister. Page 2, 2019 says this. If there is an allegation about a breach of the code and the Prime Minister, having consulted the Cabinet Secretary, feels that it warrants further investigation, he may ask the Cabinet Office to investigate the facts of the case. Page 2, 2019 again says ministers only remain in office for so long as they retain the confidence of the Prime Minister. He is the ultimate judge of the standards of behaviour expected of a minister and of the appropriate consequences of a breach of any of those standards. So this means in effect the Prime Minister is judge, jury and executioner for any suspected breach of the Ministerial Code. And I'm sure you can already foresee that this might be a fundamental weakness of the Ministerial Code, and indeed of IMR and CMR, in which it is a key part. So what examples are there of IMR being enforced? There are lots. So there's some historical examples and there are some more recent examples. Generally in politics, we want to use the more recent examples. However, if there is a good older example, there's absolutely nothing wrong with using that whatsoever. So in 1982, for example, as we know, the Argentinian government invaded the Falkland Islands. They are islands just off the coast of Argentina, which are controlled by Britain, owned by Britain, and the people there want to remain British. However, the Argentinian government, in an attempt to deflect from some of the economic problems happening within their country at the time, decided to invade these islands. Now, there were some warnings that this might be happening. And there was even a captain in the South Atlantic called Nicholas Barker who warned that an invasion was likely. Lord Carrington, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time, he was not necessarily completely aware of how significant the threat was, but because he was Foreign Secretary, because he should have known as Foreign Secretary under IMR, he resigned following the invasion of the Falkland Islands. In 2018, a very recent case, really, in the grand scheme of things, Amber Rudd was Home Secretary, and there were reports that children of the Windrush generation were being threatened with deportation by the UK government if they couldn't explicitly prove they should be allowed to remain in the UK. And it was reported that the Home Office had targets for the number of immigrants they would aim to remove from the UK. And during a Select Committee hearing, Yvette Cooper, who was chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, questioned Amber Rudd about this target for deportations. And in this Select Committee hearing, Amber Rudd said she was not aware of any targets. Yvette Cooper had just heard evidence from a senior civil servant that said there were targets. So Amber Rudd didn't appear to know what was happening in her own department. And I'll put the clip of that. Yvette Cooper, Amber Rudd discussion in the links afterwards. Now, following this, the Guardian newspaper was given emails that suggested that Rudd had known about targets for role removal. Rudd claimed that whilst there might have been a memo copied to her office, she hadn't read it, and therefore she didn't know, but she did accept she should have known as Home Secretary, and therefore she resigned because she admitted she'd inadvertently misled the House and that she hadn't corrected the record at the time. So Amber Rudd resigned under IMR. In 1998 and 2001, Peter Mandelson left government twice because of IMR. In 1998, he became Secretary of State for Trade, and then 5 months later was asked to resign when it emerged that he'd taken a loan from a fellow MP, which he hadn't declared as he was expected to do. He returned to the government in 1999 as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and then in 2001, for the second time, he was forced to resign after accusations he'd fast-tracked the passport application of an associate. Now, in these cases, these were very much personal failings, something which Peter Mandelson had done wrong on a personal level. But because he was responsible for his own personal conduct as a representative of the government, he resigned under IMR. And there's this example from 2002, which I've always really liked. Estelle Morris, the Education Secretary, she made a number of promises, a commitment to oversee a rise in literacy levels. There was a furore of A-level marking, which wasn't up to scratch. And essentially, Estelle Morris resigned, admitting that she was simply just not up to the job. And there's something quite refreshing about that resignation, which is why I left that in there, even though it's quite a historic example now. And then Matt Hancock last year. So Matt Hancock was the Health Secretary during the COVID-19 pandemic, and as such, he was responsible for drafting the COVID restrictions that put different rules in place that restricted people's liberty, but were there to try to keep the public safe. Then, in June 2021, the Sun obtained footage leaked by someone, we assume, that showed he flouted his own COVID-19 rules whilst having an affair with an aide. Now, the fact he was having an affair, some people might find morally questionable. That was not why he was forced to resign under IMR. He was forced to resign because he wasn't following the restrictions that his government and his department, more precisely, had put in place. So he was forced to resign, and he famously said, "I understand the enormous sacrifices that everybody in this country has made, that you have made, that those of us who make the rules have got to stick by them, and that's why I have got to resign." So he accepted he had breached IMR and therefore had to resign. So there are quite a lot of examples of IMR in action. So some being enforced because of personal failings, some being enforced because of governmental failings and not knowing what was going on in one's own department, and some because the minister simply didn't believe they were up to the job. However, There are also many examples of IMR not being enforced. And a good example of this comes from Priti Patel in 2020. So there are allegations that she wasn't treating civil servants in her department very well at all. In particular, permanent secretary of the Home Office, a man called Philip Rutnam. And there was an independent Cabinet Office inquiry into her behaviour. And this inquiry found that she had not met the requirements of the Ministerial Code to treat civil servants with consideration and respect. The Ministerial Code says this: harassing, bullying or other inappropriate or discriminating behaviour wherever it takes place is not consistent with the Ministerial Code and will not be tolerated. So Priti Patel had essentially been found in an independent report to have been bullying people within her department. She'd been found to have been a bully. However, Boris Johnson refused to ask for her resignation and refused to sack her. In fact, the fact he'd failed to do this was so serious that Sir Alex Allen, who wrote the report after the inquiry, actually resigned in protest that the Prime Minister hadn't done anything about this. But the Prime Minister didn't want to sack Priti Patel. She appeals to a part of his party that he struggles to maybe make ground with, the kind of really strong social conservative element of the Conservative Party. So because of that, he didn't want to sack her. But it shows that IMR, one of the biggest weaknesses is simply that the Prime Minister is the judge, jury and executioner. And he didn't want to make this decision, and therefore he didn't. Perhaps even more significantly, given that he is the Prime Minister, there are accusations, of course, that Boris Johnson himself has failed to tell the truth to Parliament, that he has misled Parliament. There was a video produced by Peter Stefanovic which went viral last year, which had over 42 million views when I last saw it, that put together a compilation of times that Boris Johnson was alleged to have misled Parliament. But even since this video has been created, the Prime Minister has, of course, been embroiled with Partygate. It's been suggested that he has misled Parliament over these parties. Firstly, that he was horrified by any parties that had taken place, that he didn't know about any parties that had taken place, but then it appears that he did know they had taken place because he attended one. Now, the Metropolitan Police is investigating this at the moment. There was a Sue Gray report which said there were very serious questions to be asked by the government. It's quite clear that if Boris Johnson did mislead Parliament over this issue, that under IMR he should be expected to resign. The Ministerial Code says it is of paramount importance that ministers give accurate and truthful information to Parliament, correcting any inadvertent error at the earliest opportunity. Ministers who knowingly mislead Parliament will be expected to offer their resignation to the Prime Minister. However, those last few words are quite significant, aren't they? The arbiter of whether Boris Johnson has breached the Ministerial Code is Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is unlikely to force Boris Johnson to resign. So there's a fundamental problem there. The Queen is not going to ask Boris Johnson to resign. She's not going to be forced into making that political judgment. That's something that she just won't do. So there's a real problem with IMR if it's the Prime Minister who's been the one who's alleged to have breached it. And then there are a couple of examples of ministers who've generally been considered to just be really bad at their job. And, that doesn't mean they were, but there's definitely been a perception that that is the case. And one of these individuals is Chris Grayling, who for many years had a reputation, whether deserved or not, for being one of the worst government ministers. He had a number of jobs: Transport Secretary, Leader of the House of Commons, Justice Secretary. He had a lot of high profile, big jobs. And there's a list of things here that happened under him. So, for example, in 2014, he banned books being sent to prisoners, which was seen as a really retrograde step when you want to encourage literacy within prisons. In 2010, he was recorded saying that B&B should have the right to turn away gay couples. At the time, the Conservative Party was trying to present that more compassionate image. David Cameron was certainly trying to move the Conservative Party to a more liberal stance on such issues. And yet Chris Grayling was recorded saying this. He cut legal aid, which means disadvantaged people find it much, much harder to find justice than other people in society. And then in one of the more amusing ones, he offered a post-Brexit ferry contract to a company that not only had no ferries, but never owned a ferry before. So there's lots of examples here where Chris Grayling, who was nicknamed Failing Grayling, wasn't up to the job. And yet, rather than being sacked and rather than resigning, which is the very clear convention under Ministerial Code, he simply was reshuffled each time there was a reshuffle and was never actually removed. Another example that is somewhat similar is that of Gavin Williamson. As Education Secretary, many people believed that he wasn't very good. And there are a number of examples of this: chaos over the August 2020 exam results, the algorithm which Boris Johnson said was a mutant algorithm, repeated U-turns over big issues like free school meals, threatening to take legal action against schools for closing and then closing schools in the very near future afterwards because of COVID-19, failing to provide equipment for disadvantaged students during COVID-19. There are lots of examples where Gavin Williamson was seen to be not up to the task, and yet he was kept in government. Now, there's lots of conspiracy theories about why that might be. He was chief whip, maybe he knew some things on senior members of the government, etc. Ultimately, we don't know. But it's quite clear that many people believe he simply wasn't up to the job, and yet he remained in position. But under the ministerial code, the convention is, if you're not good at your job, you should resign, just like Estelle Morris did in 2002. So there are lots of potential strengths and weaknesses of the Convention of IMR. It ensures that there's always someone accountable for everything that happens in government. So theoretically, this stops ministers from just passing the buck. It keeps the civil service on their toes. Civil servants know that if they do something wrong, it could end up with their minister getting sacked, something they won't want to happen. And it also facilitates the work of the opposition. So the fact you have one minister responsible for their department in all aspects makes it easier for a shadow minister to have the job of scrutinising that minister and that department. So there are some clear strengths of IMR, but there are also some weaknesses. Ministers very rarely resign due to ministerial failures. This is because accepting resignation by the Prime Minister would actually undermine government as a whole. It would show the government isn't doing a good job. If there's a bad minister, the Prime Minister is the person who appointed them to that job. It reflects on him or her. So therefore, poor ministers can end up staying in government. Increasingly also, despite being ultimately responsible, ministers are increasingly able to blame special advisors and civil servants for their mistakes. So lots of you will recall recently, or in December, I think it was, last year, there was the video of special advisors and civil servants at Downing Street joking about whether there had been parties and how they should respond to questions in a press conference. Rather than a minister resigning for this, Allegra Stratton resigned. In the Gavin Williamson case, in the exams in 2020, rather than him resigning and taking responsibility, Sally Collier, who was a civil servant who was head of Ofqual, she resigned instead. So ministers seemingly are increasingly able to pass the blame to civil servants and special advisors, which weakens the idea of IMR. Also, where ministers do resign, often it's a tactical decision in order to take pressure off of the government. And often ministers can find themselves back in government before very long whatsoever. So Peter Mandelson is a really good example of that. He was sacked in 1998. He rejoined the government in 1999. Often the government is less concerned with reality than with image. A good example of this was a little while ago now. In fact, I've put 2021 there. It wasn't 2021. I just have to go double check when that was. Apologies. I'll put it in the comments. But Andrew Mitchell was alleged to have told a police officer to learn his effing place, and he was a pleb. The police officer, I think, had kind of slowed him down when he was moving out of Downing Street. Now, clearly this was rude. Clearly it was wrong if this happened. Mitchell denied it, so it's his word against the officers. But in this case, there were some problems regarding image. Andrew Mitchell had actually been off to go visit the Carlton Club, which was one of London's kind of most prestigious venues and was often frequented by prominent Tories. So that image of the Tories being elitist and out of touch, that was the narrative surrounding this story. Arguably, Andrew Mitchell didn't deserve to be sacked for this. It was his word against the officers. And actually, you know, if he'd apologised for his actions, etc., he was having a bad day, maybe that a resignation under this maybe might have been a bit too much. But in this case, it was the image of what was being portrayed about the Conservatives that was really focused of the attention of the media, and therefore Mitchell was asked to resign. Sometimes ministers are arguably held to an unfair moral standard, particularly when it comes to alleged failings in their personal lives. There are lots of examples you'll be able to find of that. But finally, most significantly, I think, as IMR is based on statutes, not convention, it cannot be adequately scrutinised by Parliament. The appointment and dismissal of ministers is a royal prerogative power. Therefore, if a minister is if the government don't remove a minister, there is nothing really that Parliament can do about it. They can talk about it in the chamber, they can criticise it, they can brief the media, but they cannot actually force the government into taking any action over it. So that's quite a significant weakness of IMR as well. So what famous examples of collective ministerial responsibility being enforced are there? Now, one of the most famous ones in the last 20 or so years is most definitely the resignation in 2003 of Robin Cook over the Iraq War. Now, Robin Cook was a very senior Labour minister. At the time he was leader of the House of Commons. Beforehand, he'd been Foreign Secretary. And alongside Peter Mandelson, Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, he'd been a key figure in the formation of New Labour. However, in 2003, Tony Blair planned to join George Bush in going to war in Iraq if the conditions of Saddam Hussein to give up weapons of mass destruction that they believed at the time that Saddam had weren't followed through. But Robin Cook disagreed with this. He disagreed with the decision to go to war with Iraq without first seeking a new resolution from the UN Security Council. So he moved from the front benches, he moved to the back benches, where he gave one of the most powerful speeches ever heard in the House of Commons. And again, I'll put the link in the comments so you can watch it if you want to. Now, during this speech, he didn't criticise Tony Blair beyond the decision to hold a vote on going to war in Iraq without seeking a second resolution. And he famously said at the end, and I think this really shows collective ministerial responsibility very well, he said, "I intend to join those tomorrow night who will vote against military action now. It is for that reason, and that reason alone, and with a heavy heart, that I resign from the government." So he was saying he doesn't disagree with New Labour policy. He thinks Tony Blair is the most successful leader of the Labour Party in his lifetime. And he even said that in his speech. But because of one aspect of Labour policy he couldn't get on terms with, he was going to resign from the cabinet, and he did so. Another very famous historical example is that of Geoffrey Howe in 1990. Now, Margaret Thatcher had a very difficult end to her premiership with the poll tax issues and with increasing discontent within her party over her policies towards Europe. And Geoffrey Howe had been a very prominent member of her government. He had been in her government the whole time since 1979 all the way through to 1990. And in 1990 he was her deputy prime minister. But he was increasingly disillusioned with her policy towards Europe. And what's quite significant about Geoffrey Howe's resignation is he was known to be a quiet man. He was an unlikely assassin. He was unlikely to stab his leader in the back. But this made his speech upon retiring even more powerful. And one of the most famous lines in that speech was when he gave a cricket metaphor. He said, "It is rather like sending your opening batsman to the crease, only for them to find, as the first balls are being bowled, that their bats have been broken before the game by the team captain." And again, I'll put the link to that speech in the comments. A more recent example is Lord Frost. Now, Lord Frost was a special advisor to Boris Johnson. He was quite close to Boris Johnson, and he'd been given a peerage so he could sit in the cabinet and oversee Brexit policy after Britain had signed a withdrawal agreement but had to organise things like the Northern Ireland Protocol. But he resigned from the government in December 2021, not over an area of his brief, not over the issue of Brexit, but actually over Boris Johnson's plans for Plan B COVID restrictions, so things like vaccine passports. He was very discontent with this decision, and therefore, based on that, he resigned. Another very recent one is Lord Agnew. This was a really dramatic resignation in the House of Lords. You don't get that much drama in the House of Lords, but Lord Agnew certainly provided that at the start of 2022. When he resigned from the dispatch box, he literally handed his resignation letter over to a fellow member of the government to go and hand it to Boris Johnson, because he was unhappy with the government's dealing with claims that companies had fraudulently used COVID-19 relief. He said the current state of affairs are not acceptable, and as such, it feels strongly dishonest to stay on in that role. And then he marched out of the House of Lords. So quite a dramatic resignation under collective ministerial responsibility. Again, I'll put the link in the comments. But no issue has led to more examples of CMR being enforced than Brexit. Now, Theresa May was in a very difficult position when it came to her cabinet post-Brexit. She had to try to find a balance between Remainers and Leavers. She had to try to get that balance right, and that was never really going to be straightforward. But a number of her most prominent cabinet members resigned over Brexit. In July 2018, David Davis resigned over the Chequers plan, which he disagreed with. Boris Johnson resigned, I think, just one day later as Foreign Secretary, so one of the big beasts in the cabinet. And then Dominic Raab, who'd replaced David Davis in July, then resigned in November. And in total, 36 government ministers resigned because of Brexit and collective responsibility. There's been no other event in British history, no other premiership in British history that has seen so many resignations under collective ministerial responsibility. So looking at Brexit is a really good one to look at when it comes to CMR. Now, there are occasions when CMR is put aside. And traditionally, one of those has been referendums, national referendums at least. The problem with holding a referendum is it's normally on a controversial issue. It's normally on an issue where there are clear differences of opinion. And to try and hold your cabinet together under CMR in those circumstances is never really going to work. So in 1975 and in 2016, on the referendums on Europe, both prime ministers decided to allow their cabinet members to campaign in different ways. So, for example, in 2016, David Cameron campaigned for Remain, but Priti Patel, Michael Gove and others campaigned to leave the European Union and therefore were left outside collective responsibility. Collective responsibility has also been relaxed, if not set aside, during periods of coalition. When two parties in coalition with each other, there's naturally going to be disagreements. There are naturally going to be things that one party in the coalition has to accept but doesn't agree with. So if CMR was held just as tightly during coalition, the coalition just wouldn't have lasted. So there had to be some relaxation of collective responsibility. Not abandonment, because equally that would cause chaos in itself, but some relaxation. And a good example of that was Vince Cable. Vince Cable was a very prominent member of the coalition, a very prominent Liberal Democrat in the coalition, but he was regularly found to be at odds in public with Conservative cabinet members. In particular, in 2013, he criticised the Conservative Party quite widely for what he called their ugly and blinkered policies, in particular attacking policies towards immigration, the economy and Europe. Now, David Cameron could have sacked him under CMR, but he probably wouldn't have been doing himself any favours if he did so. So he kept Vince Cable in the cabinet. He allowed him to speak out sometimes just to let off that tension rather than trying to enforce CMR. And the more political example of CMR being put aside is when certain ministers are given more latitude to be critical of the government than others, particularly based on their seniority experience, or perhaps most importantly, their political popularity. And a good example of this can be seen in the fact that Theresa May kept Boris Johnson in her cabinet even when he was writing critical newspaper articles whilst being Foreign Secretary. Now, Theresa May didn't really want to have Boris Johnson in her cabinet, but she really didn't have a choice. He was too powerful, he was too big a beast, as is often said. And by having him in the cabinet, she hoped to keep him under control. The saying that it's better to have someone inside of your tent peeing out than outside of your tent peeing in comes to mind here. She thought she could have more control over him in this way. In fact, it didn't work massively well, but there was some sense that Boris Johnson was holding back from criticism whilst he remained in the cabinet. And another good example actually involves Theresa May again, but this time with Michael Gove. They were both very senior cabinet ministers, and they had a very public spat over radicalisation in schools. Theresa May said the Education Secretary should be doing more within schools. The Education Secretary, Michael Gove, said the Home Office should be doing more to tackle this issue, and it really became quite nasty. They were briefing against each other in the papers, and it really wasn't good for David Cameron. Now, David Cameron would have probably been within his rights to sack them under collective responsibility, but they were both two bigger ministers. The Education Secretary, Michael Gove, was seen as a potential future leader, and Theresa May also seen as a potential future leader, a long-standing Home Secretary and a powerful person in the cabinet. So David Cameron had to kind of get the cabinet secretary to talk them down and to compromise and try to get some kind of ceasefire between them, but actually couldn't really sack them because it would have left him in a vulnerable position. And finally, collective responsibility is left aside when there are free votes in the House of Commons. Now, this doesn't happen too often, but on big issues of conscience, often the Prime Minister will relax the whipping in the House of Commons and let his ministers vote how they feel. So, for example, David Cameron, in the coalition alongside the Liberal Democrats, held a vote on same-sex marriage in 2013. Philip Hammond, who was then the Defence Secretary, decided to abstain in this vote as an issue of conscience. Now, if this had been a whip vote and a member of the cabinet abstained and refused to vote for the policy, they would be sacked for breaching collective responsibility. However, because this was a non-whipped free vote, Philip Hammond was able to exercise his own moral judgment over this issue, and that's what he was allowed to do. So, what are the strengths and weaknesses of CMR then? So one is that there is some flexibility, it's not concrete. So free votes, referendums, Prime Ministers can use this, can give a little bit of latitude. Having collective responsibility also reinforces cabinet government. If there's a common message coming from the government, that's good because it provides unity, a common purpose, and that's probably quite helpful. It also encourages joined up thinking in government because when departments make a decision, it impacts other departments. So talking about it behind closed doors is a really positive thing. And finally, it actually encourages debate to happen behind closed doors. Now, there's a recent example of that between two very prominent cabinet members. Boris Johnson introduced his living with COVID plan, so getting rid of the restrictions. And the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, and Health Secretary Sajid Javid disagreed hugely over whether to carry on offering free lateral flow tests, which were costing a lot of money. They disagreed on this issue in private. In fact, they disagreed so much that a cabinet meeting had to be delayed because they were arguing. But when the decision was made, and the decision was made to scrap free lateral flow tests, Sajid Javid went on the telly the next day and he said that this is the policy, I support it. So he abided by collective responsibility. He'd made his point in private, he'd made his arguments, he hadn't won, and now he just accepted the decision taken collectively by the cabinet. In terms of weaknesses, in recent years, cabinet responsibility, collective responsibility has been harder to maintain because of the predominance of leaks. The WhatsApp culture whereby ministers can text via WhatsApp a journalist anonymously has really allowed ministers to brief against each other. And even at the top levels of government, this has happened. So Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, for example, were briefing against each other in the media in the sort of around 2002, 2003, 2004. It really wasn't good. They weren't really even on speaking terms, but they weren't doing it explicitly, but they were still undermining collective responsibility by doing this via the media. Secondly, some ministers are simply too powerful to sack. So Tony Blair could never sack Gordon Brown. It would have never been possible for him. It would have been politically suicidal. For the same reason, Theresa May had to hold on to Boris Johnson, even though she probably didn't want to. And further to this, a bit like IMR, enforcing collective responsibility is entirely at the discretion of the Prime Minister. So it's not legally binding, so it's up to a Prime Minister whether or not they want to actually remove someone under the doctrine of collective responsibility, which might be seen to be a weakness. There's too much power in the hands of the Prime Minister. So overall, how significant are the doctrines of IMR and CMR? I would argue CMR is actually still quite significant. Most ministers do respect collective responsibility. They do try to present that united and unified message. So I would say it is still quite significant and it helps to oil the wheels of cabinet government. However, its significance is undermined by the fact that the PM can relax it entirely at their own discretion. And the willingness to do that is impacted by political considerations, whether it might be that a minister is too powerful, for example. IMR arguably should be really significant and should be a really effective check on the government, but it just isn't. The fact the Prime Minister is judge, jury and executioner massively undermines IMR. And there have been lots of recent examples, like Priti Patel, that have shown the PM not willing to enforce the ministerial code because of how it would reflect on his government and on him personally. And really the only way to solve this would be to have an independent parliamentary committee that dealt with these issues. That's just not going to happen because prime ministers are not willing to give up their royal prerogative powers over appointments and dismissing ministers. It's one of the most important powers they have to make sure they are staying in control of the government. So even though that's probably the solution, it's just not going to happen. So overall, IMR and CMR, they're important conventions, but arguably they're less significant than they really should be in a British political system, especially in the case of IMR.